conversation. And today my guest is Kate Messner. And I've been a fan of Kate for a long time and finally met her at NCT Allen this year. And we were able to chat and she agreed to have a conversation. So Kate, how are you doing?
I am fantastic. How are you doing, Stephen?
I'm doing great. You survived the holidays, I trust. And
I did. I did. We had a really nice time. Kind of on the quiet side. We had the kids here. It was fantastic. How
yeah,
about you?
yeah, we got to see one of our kids. The rest we saw during Thanksgiving or other times. It was kind of in-laws year, right? So we didn't
Yeah,
see
that
them all.
happens.
That happens too. But we had a pretty quiet time here, and I got a chance to read some books and read some of yours. And my word, Kate, can you remember when your first book was published? What year was that?
Yeah, so my first nationally published book was 2009, and that was a novel called The Brilliant Fall of Gianna Z, about a seventh grader who had this huge school leaf collection project that was taking over her life. That came out in 2009, won the E.B. White Read Aloud Award for older readers. So that was kind of the start of my career as a novelist.
Well, you go back to that, how many books you've produced in that time period, you've been prolific. So do you have a problem with needing something to do? You just seem like you've been able to figure out the productivity side of it. And for people that don't know you, because sometimes we exist in these isolated academic worlds, we do young adult or we do children's, or we don't cross over as much as we probably should. But you have a strong collection of early readers, of really wonderful picture books, and you have just kind of covered the gamut from I'm old enough to open a book and look at the pictures to upper middle grades. And I was really interested in one series that I wanted to ask you about, and that was the Over and Under
Sure.
books. I love that idea. So for those of you who don't know, you take something like the wetlands and then you have an over and under, and then it explores what the world looks like under that and above that. So where did that come from?
Yeah, so the first book in that series was Over and Under the Snow, which was published pretty early on in my career. And the spark for that book actually grew out of a school field trip. I used to be a middle school language arts teacher, and I worked on a team with a social studies and science and math teacher. And every winter, we would take our students snowshoeing in the Adirondack Mountains, where I live in northern New York, and look for animal tracks in the snow. And so on one of those field trips, we were hiking along in our snowshoes and we came to this little tiny hole in the snow, about that big. And leading up to it were a tiny set of animal tracks that went all the way up to the hole and then disappeared. And when we saw this, our guide, our naturalist who was with us, got so excited. She said, "Oh my goodness, look, this means that we have had a visitor from the subnivean zone." And, we're out there with 27th graders and they're like, "What? What's that?" And she said, "Oh, the subnivean zone is the phrase we use to describe the secret network of tunnels and caves under the winter snow. And all the smallest animals in the forest, little deer mice and moles and voles, know they can go down there to be a little bit safer from predators, a little bit warmer, maybe even find some bits of leftover food." And, so we continued on our way, but I could not get that idea out of my mind. The whole rest of the snowshoe hike, I was thinking the subnivean zone. And I said, "So are you telling me that the whole time we've been hiking today, like 3 or 4 miles, there's been a secret invisible world going on down there?" And she said, "Yeah." And I was blown away. My writer's light bulb went off like that, and, I couldn't stop thinking about that idea that anytime you're out in the snow, you're hiking over this secret invisible world. So when I got back to the school bus, it was time to go, and that was the one day I always, always, always have a writer's notebook with me.
Yeah.
That was the one day I had left it back in the classroom, but I had a one piece of paper in my pocket, and it was the list of students I was supposed to not lose on the field trip. It was the
Right.
attendance paper. And I had that and a little stub of a miniature golf pencil. So I took the attendance. They were all there. That was good. And on the field trip bus, on the school bus, on the way home from that field trip, in my bumpy school bus handwriting, I wrote the very rough draft of Over and Under the Snow, a story about
Wow.
a girl who goes cross country skiing with her dad and discovers that secret world under the snow. So that book, and in fact, the rest of the series, we have 7 or 8 of them now, are illustrated by Christopher Silas Neal, and he has just brought so
Yeah.
much magic to that series.
Yeah, I exploring that was kind of fun, because um I never taught a children's literature class or did children's literature, but I have grandkids of various ages now, and it's always interesting to see where to push them. So that was a really interesting find, which I thought was really clever. And as you know, having taught in the middle grades, there's so much more education to be done if you can do interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary work. And complete immersion is often difficult with English and math and English and science. We either don't take the time to develop those connections, or we tend to be, even against all middle level advice and suggestion, we tend to be pretty siloed. So I think a collection like this for kids in elementary grades is a really great introduction to how science and language arts can be hand in hand. Subnivian. See, I don't I don't know if I've ever heard that word in my life, right?
Well, there you go.
Yeah,
You
so
can always learn something.
yeah. Started out career-wise as a language arts teacher then.
I actually started out as a journalist. That was what I
Okay.
went to college for. My undergraduate degree is in broadcast journalism. So I was actually a TV news reporter and producer for about 7 years out of college, and then I went back
Wow.
to school to get my master's in teaching, and taught middle school language arts seventh graders for about 15 years. And it was while I was teaching, while I was sharing
That
lots
you
of stories with my kids, that I was starting to write. So my first, gosh, 6 books, I think, were published while I was teaching full time, and then I made the transition to be a full time writer.
Yeah, it can be difficult to try to make that switch, but there in the children's literature and in the young adult community, there are a lot of people who have teaching roots. Sometimes they're not actual teachers, but then you find out a mom or a dad was a teacher, and then you go, "Oh, you people aren't so far away from some of this as we might like." But if you're a journalist, then you've certainly learned the art of producing stories on a deadline and learning how to put things together. So some of that journalism practice, I'm sure, was how you started consolidating notes and taking the things together. How much is research now involved in the creation of a book?
Yeah, I mean, so I write both fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah,
And sometimes when I do school visits, kids are surprised to know that there is often almost as much research involved in the fiction as the nonfiction.
yeah,
Obviously, I work on books like the History Smasher series with Random
yeah.
House. Those are aimed at smashing myths about history, and those are very immersive as in terms of the research. I'm up to my ears in research, reading and talking with experts and taking field trips for months and months before I even start writing. But even for a fictional book, even for a novel, uh,
Hmm.
I spend a lot of time doing research on every element of that book. I really believe that if you've got a character who is different from you in any way at all, that requires real research. And, how interesting would it be if all of our characters were just us? So.
Yeah, yeah. That's well, yeah. I'm actually having to give a guest lecture at a university in a couple weeks about the value of literature in our lives, right? And that's one of the key entrances for me. Literature has always been a way for me to um, explore the other and
Mhm.
explore my friends, that I can never duplicate their experience, and some of the uniqueness of my own. Literature's been a gateway to that. And I think if you learn to research at all, you find out that both fiction and nonfiction can give you a window to a world that can be quite rejuvenating, I think. Mystery Smashers are great titles too. I was looking through there. You've written from anywhere from the Titanic, which I'm sure was successful. I think I had a daughter who thought studying history was watching the Titanic 30 times in one year,
It is
so
popular with those fourth and fifth graders.
yeah. So, but because of that, she ended up reading other things about the Titanic, right? Because she was watching the film. But I love the one that you have on women's rights and to vote. You have one on the Mayflower, and you touch um, things, plagues and pandemics to witch trials. So you've done a really lot of heavy lifting in terms of nonfiction for young readers. So how and I know there's time frames of this because I'm interested. If you know you're going to write, let's take the Salem Witch Trials. You have a parameter of how long it needs to be. So
Yep.
how long does that book kind of take you from, okay, I've got the contract, I'm going to research it, I'm going to write it. What do those smashing history books look like in terms of a workload for you as a writer?
So typically, when Random House signs up a new History Smashers book, we will go back and forth a bit about titles, about topics. When I first pitched the series, I sent a list of, gosh, I think maybe 10 topics, and they were like, "Oh, we want this one, this one. Also, what about this?" And they brought in some topics of their own, and I really enjoy that collaboration
Yeah,
process because their suggestions are often coming from educators and librarians, and they're saying,
yeah,
this is what teachers are asking us for, this is what librarians say they need, this is what kids have been asking for. So there's a lot of back and forth as far as the topics. It has to be something that I'm fascinated enough with, to devote the better part of a year of my life to. So typically when I get started, I will just really immerse myself in the research for, 4 to 6 months. Reading, talking with experts, traveling when I can to see the places, to visit the museums, to actually, I love to have my feet on the ground in a place if I'm going to write about it, if I can. And so I will, while I'm doing that research, be thinking about the shape of the book. And as you mentioned, it is a series, and like any series, there are some things that are consistent. There are some constants. History Smashers is multimodal, which means a lot of the story is told through comics. There are
yeah,
lots of photographs and captions and charts and timelines and lots of illustrations. We're fortunate to have just some incredible illustrators working on this series. Dylan McConis, who illustrated all of the first 3 books, and then needed to take a break from the art, has continued to do the cover art. And
oh,
most of the interior art now is done by Fallon Cook, who is, again, an absolutely phenomenal comic artist. And I'm really lucky. They do a lot of the heavy lifting as far as the storytelling.
yeah,
Comics are such an engaging way to share history with kids, and such in a way that really grabs them and meets them where they are. It makes it just much more engaging. So after I spend, those 4 to 6 months doing research, while I'm doing that research, I'm getting an idea for what those 10 chapters are going to be. The History Smashers books always have about 10 chapters. Usually they're presented mostly chronologically, although some of them, I'll be honest, cover just huge swaths of time.
yeah,
Ancient Egypt, we're talking about a span of, 3,000 years. And the same thing with plagues and pandemics. That book goes all the way back to ancient diseases,
yeah,
the plague of Athens and the Black Death during the Middle Ages, and then all the way up to modern diseases like, avian influenza and COVID-19.
yeah,
So in some cases, we're talking about really big swaths of time. There's no way to cover everything. And so I always ask myself, what's the most important? What's had the most impact historically? And what's going to be the most fascinating thing for kids? Because History Smashers are not a replacement for other history books, but I really like to look at them as a gateway book. They're books that really tend to get kids jazzed about history, and then they can, go off and learn more about that. Let's say they got fascinated with this one battle of the American Revolution, reading the,
yeah.
3 pages or so about it in History Smashers. Then they can go off and just do a deep dive into that topic, and I get lots of emails from kids who tell me that that's exactly what they do.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. So getting sometimes one of the biggest problems in educators, I was in the classroom, public school classroom for 25 years. Sometimes the difficulty is just getting their attention. If you can get their attention on something that they like, in any way connected to the curriculum, well, that's such a win
It
because
is.
then they'll be, one of my mottos was own your own learning. Well, as soon as they find that discovery, they will try to own their own learning. But if you haven't caught them and they're not caught into the catch of it all, it takes them a while to get interested. So I love that idea about those uh, those history books because I think there are quite a number of you, I would say, in young adult and middle grades who are doing really good service to nonfiction right now. And I think that we probably can't have enough of it. And more of us as academics that are uh, in love with the story need to look at the story of the stories of history as well as the fictional narratives. So I'm kind of building up your career. I want to talk about your chapter books. And we're going to talk about The Trouble with Heroes, which is the new one that's going to come out pretty soon. But you write dogs pretty well in this one. So, we all fall in love with the dog in The Trouble with Heroes, but you have a chapter book series with Ranger. So tell me a little bit about how that came about, because there's what, 12 of them now?
There are. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So the Ranger in Time series is a chapter book adventure series, and they're about a time traveling search and rescue dog. So Ranger is this golden retriever who's been trained in modern day search and rescue techniques. He's been trained to track missing people by following their scent and to help people who are in trouble. And one day he's digging in the family garden when he unearths this magical old first aid kit that allows him to time travel. So then suddenly he can go anywhere in history where people could use his help. So that opens up just, you know, so many possibilities for stories. The first book in that series launched exactly 10 years ago today, as a matter of fact, in 2015. The first book we tackled was Rescue on the Oregon Trail. And from there, we explored all different events in history. And that was a collaboration with Scholastic. So I worked with Scholastic, several different editors on that. But in much of the same way that we do the History Smashers now, we would go back and forth about topics. And we'd say, what about, teachers are asking for this. They really want more on the Oregon Trail, or they'd like something on the American Revolution. And so it's always a mix of, what really would serve educators and what are kids fascinated with, and what am I excited to write about too.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, Ranger's been all over the world, which means I've been all over the world doing research for those books. We covered the Oregon Trail, ancient Rome, the Underground Railroad, Antarctic exploration, the Great California Earthquake of 1906, the American Revolution. We've got, the Titanic, Pearl Harbor, D-Day. And it's interesting. One of the books in that series is not one that I had planned to write, and that is Escape from the Twin Towers, the Ranger and Time book
Oh,
about September 11th. And that book actually came about because soon after the first Ranger and Time books came out in 2015, 2016, I was doing lots of school visits. A lot of schools use those books as their all school read or their one
yeah.
school, one book, one school program. And so I was doing lots of school visits. And at one of those school visits, I was taking questions from kids, and a little second grader raised her hand and she said, "Could you please write a Ranger in Time book about September 11th?" And it took me aback a little bit because, to me, these books are about history.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to think of September 11th as history, right? When I
Yes.
still remember it so vividly. My daughter, who's in grad school now, was an infant. She's just about a month
Yeah.
old at that time. And it's I have we as adults we have such a guttural reaction to that
Yeah.
still. And so of course I was polite to the student. I said, "Oh, that's an interesting idea. I'll put that in my writer's notebook where I keep Ranger and Time ideas." But what I was thinking was, "No, I can't write about that. Like that's not history. That's too recent. It's too sad. It's too raw."
Yeah.
And so I kind of, dismissed the idea until a few weeks later. I was at another school visit and I said, "Are there any questions?" And a third grader raises his hand and said, "Yeah, could you please write a Ranger in Time book about September 11th?"
Yeah.
And it happened again and again and again and again until I finally caught on that and realized, these kids weren't alive
Yeah.
when that happened. And to them, September 11th is sort of like Pearl Harbor feels to me,
Yeah.
right? A sad thing that happened before I was born. And they're very curious about it. They've heard the grown-ups talking about it. They know how sad it makes us to think about it. But the grown-ups don't actually really like to talk about it. And that
Yeah.
leaves kids wondering and very, very curious. And so that was why I ended up doing that Ranger in Time book about September 11th, Escape from the Twin Towers, and spent a lot of time at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York City
Yeah.
when I was working on that, and was actually able to interview several survivors who escaped from the North Tower as it was
Yeah.
collapsing. So that was um, a hard book to write, but I think a really important book, and one that still, when I ask kids at school visits, about their favorite Ranger in Time book, so many of them choose that one because they haven't been able to learn what happened on that day in too
Yeah.
many other ways.
Yeah, it's hard. We've always, I think, had a hard time teaching recent history at any grade level.
Yeah.
Sometimes the teachers feel like it's current events, and others feel like it, like you said, it can be too raw. And I've been reflecting on that quite a bit because it's one of the reasons I decided to go to graduate school. When that happened, it was so monumental, and I thought we talked a little bit about doing graduate work, and then I thought, well, you never know what tomorrow holds. So
Yeah.
what would that look like for us to end our teaching career and do university work? And so we actually, my wife and I started our PhD programs in 2002. So it was
Wow.
that year we thought and said, okay, are we in a position to do something? What would it look like? And are we ready to leave public ed to try to jump to do educational work, but at the university level? And so from my mind, it's current, right? It's
Yeah.
an event that caused me to make other decisions when I thought about the world and its place, and if I had a place in it other than the one I had, right? So it's very interesting to do that. When you draft these history books, do you have other readers who go through and fact check for you? Does the editor take that, or are you fortunate enough to have a group of collaborators that help you with that? How do you do all the fact checking for both of these?
Yeah. Yes, yes, and yes. All of those things. So there are a lot of different fact-checking gates, I guess, that
Yeah,
that books about history, or really any nonfiction or historical fiction, are going to go through. I have several writers that I work with, critique groups. And so those are sort of the first line of defense. I always have expert readers, regardless of the topic. The most recent History Smashers book that just went through this process is one coming out in 2020, 2025, 2026, maybe fall 2025, I think. And that is History Smashers Ancient Egypt. So I was fortunate to have an Egyptologist that I met
yeah,
in Cairo when I was working on the book, do a read through and read for accuracy and things. And at the same time, the editor and copy editor, there are always fact checkers involved, and so there's sort of multiple rounds of fact checking on all of those books.
yeah. It's interesting to do that, and it's got to keep you on your toes, right? I can remember even reading early on when I was a young adult, an interview with Louis L'Amour, who was one of the
Mhm.
expert
Yeah.
Western writers, and he
Yeah.
says you can't make a mistake on a weapon or how it's
No.
because
Yeah.
somebody's going to say, wait. No, that happened in 1876, and you're writing in 1873. You can't have that weapon, So it's been around for a long time where people are fact checking other people,
Yeah.
to do
And I
that.
will tell you, there is no fact checker like a passionate fifth grade reader. Right? Like that's why I'm just so careful with these things because, a Titanic buff who picks up History Smasher's Titanic, some of these kids may have already read 50 books about the Titanic.
Right.
They're so savvy, and I love how passionate kids are about those niche interests that they have.
So one more thing about the Ranger, because I'm really interested in the Ranger and time thing. I've got some grandkids that are prime targets for this, right? And do you try to stay as close to a realistic event, or do you have a side event? So you're on the Oregon Trail. Do you follow a real wagon train, or do you make up a wagon train, or how do you have the problem arise?
Yeah, it depends on the book, because
Okay.
some books are I guess broader in scope than others, right? The Oregon Trail was not a one. There was not one story of the Oregon Trail, right?
Okay.
Like there were many, many
Yeah.
families over a number of years who traveled west for at various times for various reasons. They had wildly different experiences. So for a book like that, what I'm looking at is what are the most interesting things for kids that happened along the way. My family jokes that, man, anything that can go wrong to this poor pioneer family is going to, right? You've got the cholera, you've got the everything, the mud and the river flooding and everything else. But so it's sort of all accurate information, right, about things that
Yeah.
did happen to families on the Oregon Trail, but sort of supercharged for the adventure factor, right? Because we
Yeah.
want kids to have the history, but boy, I also really want them turning the pages, and there's
Yeah.
excitement in every chapter. So with a book like that, I'm taking stories from lots of different source material. To use them with a fictional family. The
Yeah.
human characters in the Ranger in Time series are fictional.
Yeah.
But with historical events, you don't get to make up history. It's already happened,
Right.
right? The
Yeah.
details of history are set. That's the part that's not flexible for the story. And so for a book like D-Day, D-Day unfolded in a very particular way
Yeah.
with particular battalions, and they had specific boats and specific weapons and the barrage balloons and all of that. And so that history all already exists. It's already in place, and you can't mess with it. The other thing I feel strongly about is not putting words, invented words, into the mouths of
Oh,
real historical figures.
yeah.
So if a real historical person, George Washington, whoever, says something in the book, it's going to be words that actually came out of that real historical person's
Yeah.
mouth.
That you can document.
Yeah.
That's interesting because as you were talking about that, the Oregon Trail, my wife's family had a great great grandfather and great grandmother come across the plains, and one day the father, and they had two little children, and another man went out hunting, to feed the wagon
Yeah.
train, and they both got to a place on a stream where they went separate ways. And her grandfather never was found, never came back. The
Oh,
guy
wow.
went, and he went, he said, I waited and waited. I had to get back to the wagon train before and his wife wouldn't leave until they did a
Yeah.
search. And they did a search and never found him. And so she continued the trek, with two little children, and arrived in the Salt Lake Valley and everything. But that's like one of the mysteries. So
Yeah.
you need Ranger to go back and find out, did he fall and die? Did
Yeah.
Indians, did marauders, did a wild animal? The number of things that could have happened, you
Yeah.
know. Uh,
And it's interesting in writing, the Oregon Trail obviously is a little farther back in history, but still these were real people with real families, and I try
yeah,
really hard to remember that. And especially when I'm writing more recent history, there's a Ranger in Time book about Hurricane Katrina.
yes.
I was
Uh-huh.
working on that one. I spent some time in New Orleans in the lower Ninth Ward talking with people who lived through that storm. And there's a relief organization that I worked with when I was working on the book, and I was checking in with questions. And when I finished writing the book, and of course Ranger is involved in rescuing people and things. When I finished writing the book, I really wanted someone who had been there and lived
Uh,
through Katrina to read it. And so this organization helped me, hook me up with a gentleman who was able to do that, to be that survivor expert reader. And when I talked with him on the phone, I said, and when I have people read, I'm like, I'm looking for anything that's historically inaccurate or misrepresentative that doesn't represent what it was really
Right.
like, not necessarily style things, which are more
Yeah.
of my area, but anything that's not accurate, anything that you feel really misrepresents the experience. And I was talking to this gentleman, he goes, "There's nothing like that. There's nothing, it's factual, you got it all right. But that dog has got to get in there and save more people." And his voice broke.
Yeah.
Like this reading, he was feeling it and feeling the helplessness. I mean, so many people were waiting for help to arrive when that storm happened, and that just didn't come.
Yeah.
His voice broke. He said that dog has got to save more people, and I took that to heart so much. I rewrote.
Yeah.
I made him save more people. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really it's such a gift to be able to talk with people about their lived experiences with some of these stories.
Yeah, we took our first academic job at LSU up in Baton Rouge in 2008. So
Oh,
we
wow.
were able to go down pretty recently after that.
Yeah.
And people, I don't think, have any notion of what the Ninth Ward was like before that happened and after.
Yeah.
The amount of devastation, and it can be very strange because you might see a house that's entirely intact, and there'll be two or three on the block, and the rest of them were gone. They
Yeah.
just
Or just
not there.
footsteps that
Yeah,
led to nothing,
yeah,
right? And I was there years after the storm, and you could, still the houses boarded up and marked that they had been
yeah.
checked
It's
for
it has
survivors.
never it's never quite recovered in the
Yeah.
same way, the Ninth
Yeah.
Ward. But anyway, so those things are fascinating, and like you say, even though for some of us those just feel like marking events of our life, we forget that they're past for children. There's children
Yeah.
now whose relatives grew up in parts of the Ninth Ward that don't exist, right?
Yeah.
So to know the history of that is very fascinating. Well, we've come up to now where we're looking more at your middle grades, and I would say your books probably range up to about 14 or 15 for some of those. So
Yep.
you're still, I would say, kind of firmly in that middle grade area. But I this is what I tell my friends all the time. They said, "Well, you read a lot of young adult literature," and I think, well, it's really good. I'm not reading books I don't like. If I didn't like books, I would stop. And before we talk about the trouble with heroes, there's kind of two that I would like you to talk about, and maybe some of the genesis, and you can give us a synopsis. But I remember reading Breakout when it came, and the exact location of home. Do you want to talk about both of those and what they're about? Maybe give us a book thing or some of the genesis of the ideas.
Sure. So the exact location of home is actually a companion book to The Brilliant Fall of Gianna Z, which was my debut novel. And in the first book, in The Brilliant Fall of Gianna Z, there was Zig was Gianna's best friend. And there was a little bit of a crush going on there. And a lot of the feedback I got from kids after that book was, well, do they ever get together? What happened? Are they, is anything going to happen there? And so I decided that, and also Zig was a lot of kids' favorite character. And so I
Yeah,
decided that Zig needed his own book. So that's what the exact location of home is. It's about a family undergoing changes. Zig's dad is gone for reasons that become apparent late in the book. And he and his mom find themselves unhoused. They lose their apartment. And so this situation of being temporarily without shelter is one that so many kids, so many families go through, and we don't talk about it. Back in, this book came out quite some time ago. Fortunately, we have more books that address that situation now, but there weren't so many at the time. And as an educator, I was very aware of that,
yeah,
and in my seventh grade classroom, I always had, extra pencils. I had the granola bar. I really have an issue with teachers who make a big issue with a kid who doesn't have a pencil. Not everybody has a pencil. Not everybody had breakfast. Like, give the kid the pencil and, supply what they need. Give them their best chance at learning at least.
yeah,
And so I felt like that was really important. And just to make sure kids like that felt seen. And so that's, and the exact location of home is also has geocaching. It's very much a mystery.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fun in it. There's a tiny bit of romance in it. It's all of those things. But that was really the primary goal, was to give Zig his own story and offer some visibility to those kids who go through things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then Breakout is a book that was inspired by a real life prison break. So, Breakout is about what happens in a small town when two murderers break out of a maximum security prison, and there's this huge manhunt that changes the way three kids see their neighbors and the place they call home. And this book was inspired by the real life prison break at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York in
Yeah.
2015. So that is a pretty famous story now. It made nightly
Yeah.
news. Ben Stiller made a made a show about it. But at the time, it was, front page news in my community. That prison is
Yeah.
just about 14 miles as the crow flies from my house. And I'll be honest with you, Stephen, I am an anxious person on a good day. I am one of those people who is always imagining what might go wrong, and I worry about things that are out of my control, like even when nothing is wrong. So you can
Yeah.
imagine, with
On the
two
day of a
murderers
prison
skulking
breakout.
about
Yeah.
somewhere that no one could find, I was a little on edge. But I am also a former journalist. I think I mentioned my first career
Yeah.
out of college was as a TV news reporter, and I still get really, really curious when there's a big news story happening. So
Yeah.
when this happened, when this prison break happened, on about the second day, I took my writer's notebook
Yeah.
and I drove through the police roadblocks and went to the prison where they were having a news conference. And I thought, I wasn't planning to write a book for children about murderers breaking out of prison, because that doesn't even sound like a good idea when you say it out loud, right? But I knew I was curious. And as a writer, I've learned to follow that curiosity and just go with it. So I went to the news conference. They talked about how they had 1,000 police officers from all over New York searching the Adirondacks for these guys. And then I went to this coffee shop across the street from the prison, and I ordered a cup of coffee and I sat down with my laptop and my notebook, and I just kind of hung out there. And this is a small town. Not
Yeah.
very many places you can go to get a cup of coffee or a sandwich. That was kind of it. And so everybody was showing up there. Police officers would come in covered in mud and ticks from being out searching the
Oh,
these
yeah.
inmates. Families, people who lived near the prison would come in talking about how their kids were afraid to go to bed at night, how they wouldn't let their kids play outside on the trampoline. And then families from out of town were visiting too. People who had come to this town from downstate to visit their loved ones who were incarcerated in the
Yeah.
prison. And they suddenly weren't allowed to visit. And they were also terrified about
Yeah.
how their loved ones might be treated inside those prison walls while all this was happening. So, for the better part of 3 days, I just kind of hung out and I talked to people and I listened to their stories and I collected details about what was going on in town. What does it look like when there's a huge manhunt happening?
Yeah.
And about the third day, I had an idea for a story because I realized um, that this manhunt was affecting everybody who lived in this town,
Yeah.
but maybe kids most of all, because it was the beginning of summer vacation. And so backyard sleepovers canceled. Camp canceled. Camping trips, hiking trips, fishing trips, hunting trips, prom, graduation parties for the big kids. So many things got canceled, the festival, the fair, everything, because no one knew when these guys were going to
Wow.
pop out of the woods. And so it was also interesting to watch how that prison break and that manhunt brought out the best in some people and the worst in some people, and that was something I wanted to explore too. So all
Yeah.
of those issues kind of bubble up in Breakout.
Yeah. It's a pretty fascinating read. I can remember, running into that a few years ago, and again, you're as we just illustrated, over the last half hour, your range from where you're doing it is, but it seems to me you're really attuned to how cultural or current events can play out in books for kids. Seems to me that you're attuned to those kinds of things, which makes it fascinating. So before we talk about your writing process, I want to talk about the trouble with heroes. And I want to say a couple of things and not give it away. You can tell me how much, but if you love cookies, you're going to love this book. If you like dogs, you're going to love this book. If you like hiking in the mountains at any level, you're going to like this book. And if you like a kid's impatience with the know-it-all adults in their life, you're going to like this book. You know? Because as much as, kids are, I often think that, you know, when I was a high school teacher, I thought, I often had classes with 35 and 40 kids in it. And I think they're just tolerating us, because there's no way we really have control as many teachers think they're in control. I think that's just an illusion. But one of the things I love about this book is because the main character is aware that so many of these people in the book, the adults, have his best interest at heart, but he's initially not in a position to want to listen to it at any level, right? And I think you capture that tone of a kid, saying, "Okay, let me put up with you until I can get over this next mountain ridge, or I'll take your advice when I'm good and ready, not right now," right? So I love that, and um, tell us a little about the book and your connection. You have a real personal connection with this book that I find quite fascinating as well.
Sure. So The Trouble with Heroes is about a middle schooler named Finn Connolly. Here's Finn. You had a copy too, but I'll hold up mine.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and Finn, hey, we match. Finn is in trouble. Finn starts the book in trouble. He is about to fail seventh grade, and he just vandalized a cemetery over Memorial Day weekend. He kicked over a headstone, and it turns out that headstone belonged to one of the first women to climb all 46 Adirondack high peaks. So Finn gets caught on camera. It's a whole thing. And when he goes to court, the dead woman's daughter makes him this unusual offer. She says, "Look, I won't press charges. You don't even have to pay for a new headstone," which is expensive, by the way.
Yeah.
There's one thing I want you to do, though, and that is climb the 46 Adirondack high peaks and do it in a single summer, and then I'll drop all the charges. And Finn is like, "I can't do that. My mom can't go with me. She's got to work." And she's like, "No, no, no. I've got people who will go with you." He's like, "I've got to go hiking with strangers? What the heck?" And so finally he agrees to this because it's the only way to get out of this trouble. And she's like, "Oh, there's just one more thing. You have to take my mother's dog." And that's how he finds himself climbing 46 mountains with a drooly dog that he does not like. So my connection to this, my work on this book actually started when I started climbing the Adirondack high peaks in 2015. So there are 46 mountains in the Adirondacks that are over 4,000 feet tall, and it is a thing to say you climbed all of them. They call it becoming a 46er, and when you climb all of them, you get a patch that looks like this. That's all.
Uh,
But it's a whole thing. And when I climbed the first one, I was like, well, this was really hard, and I don't know that I'll do that again. But a week later, I wasn't sore anymore, and my bruises and my scrapes had healed, and I was like, well, maybe I'll just climb one more. And at that point, you realize, yes, you're gonna climb all 46. So these hikes range from half day hikes of maybe 6 or 7 miles, a 5 or 6 hour round trip hike with a couple thousand feet of elevation gain, to full day slogs through knee deep mud and, vertical, near vertical rock climbs. The longest I think is 22 miles or so, 22, 23 miles for
yeah.
these hikes. And so I did not climb them all in a single summer. I am an Adirondack 46er, but I accomplished it over 8 years. Several hikes a year during the summer season. So Finn has a much more daunting task to try to climb all of these peaks in a single summer. So when I started hiking, I had a little writer's notebook in my notebook, not this big hardcover one. I've got lightweight ones for when I have a big hike and I don't want my backpack to be too much heavier. But I always bring a notebook everywhere I go. So I had a notebook with me, and I found that I was writing poems about some of the things that I was seeing. There's one particularly lovely overlook. It's not even one of the high peaks. It's a maybe like a 4 mile hike to this ridge that looks out over the Au Sable Lakes, and there are mountains on both sides, and there's just this stunning, emerald blue and emerald valley. It's gorgeous. Um, and so I had written poems about some of these places, which is a thing that I have done in my life. I occasionally write poems. I had not written a novel in verse,
Where's,
but I was writing some poems. And after a while, poems started coming out that were not in my voice, which is weird,
uh,
right?
yeah,
But they were in the voice of someone who did not want to be climbing those mountains. Now, I suspect that this first started to happen on a really rough climb. Like, the truth about these hikes, Stephen, is some of them you get to the top and there's not even a view, right? You get to the
yeah,
top and it's a wooded summit, so there's just like some trees and a like a little sign tacked on them that says Gray Peak, right? Like you are here. Now go down. Now climb another 8 miles. And so probably it was on one of those hikes where this snarky like voice started coming out. And I was like, whose voice is this? Who are you? And again, as a writer, I learned to follow those voices. I think
yeah,
as writers, we follow the voices that show up, even if we don't know whose voices they are yet. But what I came to realize is that voice did indeed belong to Finn, this kid who got in trouble. He is grieving. His dad, who was a 9/11 firefighter and then also a paramedic during the COVID-19 pandemic, had passed away 2 years before the book starts. And uh, like many of us who lost people during the pandemic, you can't grieve in all the usual ways,
you're
right?
right.
Because you can't hold a big funeral in 2020. You can't have people all close together and hugging and breathing the same air and risking that. And so there was a lot of unresolved grief for both him and his mom. And so the book is really a journey. It's about the journey of climbing 46 mountains, but also a journey of learning to walk through grief. And that grief has all those same hang-ups, right? It's longer than you thought, and it's muddy, and sometimes you get stuck there, and all those things.
Yeah, it's a really nice story, Kate.
Yeah,
I think it would appeal to a lot of readers, like I said. Plus, and I'm assuming in the final copy you're going to have the pictures that are from some of these peaks. They're going to let you keep the photography and some of that
yeah,
in.
yeah,
Because I think that's really um, powerful for kids to realize that there are tasks that people can do.
hmm
And almost every local community has some kind of task that you could
yeah,
do as a kid, right? And do these things. But I think they're inspirational to um, find out, to watch a kid who's very much like they are when they're reading as a middle schooler, that they can have obstacles, but they can have moments of triumph as
yeah.
well. And by having those moments of triumph, um, they can realize something about themselves, and that's a great gift that I think fiction can give a lot of kids. But it's a really good read. Like I say, the one of the ways he deals with the difficulty is he comes home and he makes cookies, right? Which also plays in the story in another way as well. Also, the idea of the hero. You want to talk about why, because his dad, like you said, was really truly a 9/11 hero, but the notion of who a hero is, I think let's use my academic word, right? You trouble that really well in terms of what that is. So was that always going to be part of it, or did that kind of the title and the notion of hero work itself out in the writing?
Um, s- I I will be honest, a lot of times I have a bunch of notions for books swimming around my head at the same time.
Yeah,
And sometimes I realize that two of those books are actually the same book. So I, for a while, had been thinking, I struggle with the idea of heroes in general,
yeah,
because heroes by their, I mean, unless we're talking about, mythology or fantasy, heroes by their definition are people, and people by definition are flawed, right?
yeah,
And so in all different ways. And we're having a lot of conversations in this country right now about our heroes in history, who are also very flawed. And this is something that we talk about in a lot of the History Smashers books, right? That we've
Yeah.
got, our founding fathers, four of the five first U.S. presidents enslaved people. John
Yeah.
Adams was the only one who didn't enslave people. That is a fact. It's a verifiable fact. You can look it up and be like, oh, look, these presidents held, enslaved people, and this one didn't. And yet there are adults who lose their minds over this fact being in a book for kids, as
Yeah.
if it's like a bad fact, right? Like it's like, no, it's a fact. And kids are able to hold, I think kids are able to hold more realities in their mind at once, right? They understand that lots of things can be true at the same time. They understand that George Washington can have led the Continental Army through the Revolutionary War. They can understand that he was America's first president, and they can understand that at the same time, he was enslaving hundreds of people on his plantation in Virginia,
Yeah.
both before he was president and while he was president.
Yeah.
All of those things can be true at once and are. Um, and adults really, some adults really cannot manage this concept, right? So I've been thinking about that for a long time, and it's something that I address in my nonfiction, but also in our lives. Heroes have a lot of scars, right? When we
Yeah.
talk about our heroes, like our 9/11 heroes, the PTSD that those firefighters have endured, and the ripple effects that that had on their lives for decades after, the newspaper headlines disappeared,
Yeah.
is something that we don't always think about after the fact. And so that was something that I wanted to explore as well.
We're nearly a quarter of a century, and there are people who are doing their best to remind people that, the
Yeah.
legacy of those things are. John Stewart is one, Steve Buscemi, and
Yeah.
a couple of other people have tried to make that more public than we maybe want to hear. And that's always been frustrating to me as a teacher as well, is that if you're not going to look at your um, the flaws in your makeup or the flaws in your history, then you really are doomed to repeat it. You can't do that. And I think that it's easy for me. It's always been easy to hold contradictions in line. People can do wonderful achievements, but they can also have flaws that hold them back and hold others back sometimes.
Sure.
They both can be true. I mean, maybe Ulysses S. Grant is one of the greatest examples of that. I mean, you can be a drunk and you can be a great general, and maybe that's the perfect moment for you, is that all your talents arise in that one moment when you can rally who you are, despite all the other things you might be, right? And do those things because there's some tremendous things that take place. And I think on the other side, Robert E. Lee is another example. Robert E. Lee had a sense of dedication, but seriously flawed in terms of where his loyalty was laid and what he knew that was costing, right? To take those lines. But we don't hold those two things very well in our mind. I think you're right. There's a lot of adults that want to say, well, we want to teach clean history. We don't want to teach history that disturbs anybody, and I think, well, those histories don't exist,
No, history is as messy as people are, right? History
right.
is people, and people are messy. People are flawed. People do
Yeah.
mistakes. People do great harm. Every time there's a statue in Central Park of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Sojourner Truth, and every time I walk by it, I want to just put a little footnote about the fact that two of those three women actively fought against Black men having the right to vote.
Oh, yeah.
And there they are, as if they were all working together and everything was great. It's yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I took a NEH National Network for Humanities summer seminar once on feminist classics in American history, taught by Elizabeth Israelson Perry, who was a really important professor at Vanderbilt and Sarah Lawrence College and others. But she wrote one of the mainline, I think it was, I will get this wrong, but I think it was the Prentice Hall history book, right? For American history in high schools. And she got called to task once. They said, we think you're mentioning Eleanor Roosevelt too many times. And she said, well, well, how many times do I mention her? And they said something like 6 times or something. And she said, well, how many times do I mention Franklin? And they said, well, 38, so the fact checkers, and she said, well, wait a minute, married to a president, advocates for minors, becomes the Secretary of Labor, one of the first female in the cabinet.
Mm.
How many times should I mention somebody this important? And she said, what I ended up doing is going back and mentioning her a couple more times, instead of doing it. But we have these moments where we just want to make things look a certain way rather than, seeing what the history can be like. So now I want to shift for just one or 2 minutes. Tell me about your writing habits. We've had such a good time talking about all your book, everything else, but everybody always wants to know, how does this writer approach writing? How do you do it, Kate?
Well, my notebook is my my Bible, right?
Yeah,
My ideas are collected here, but also this is where I make plans for every day.
yeah,
On any given day, I might have, two or three different things that I'll work on. I find, on a regular writing day where I don't have, Zoom visits or school visits or speeches to give, I will get up, get some exercise, and I usually do two big writing sessions. I'll do one in the morning, and then I like to take lunch and have recess. I like to get outside a little bit at lunchtime, and then do another writing session in the afternoon. So I do one big part of my writing process is that I live with a book in my head for a long time before I start writing it, which is why when I do start writing, it often will come out fairly quickly. I do a lot of brainstorming. I do a lot of scribbling in my notebook. I do a lot of character work, character sketches, so that when I do sit down, I know the characters, I know the place. Setting is very important to me. I've collected details there. So when I do sit down to write, I have a rough outline. I know there's a lot of discussion about the plotters versus the pantsers. I'm kind of
yeah,
right in the middle. I always have an outline, but sometimes I will write and realize that I've got a better idea, and then I change the rest of the outline. So that's a part of my process too. But I think honestly, the biggest thing, the most important thing about my writing process, is the faith required. And it's interesting when I was hiking the 46 high peaks, I was thinking a lot about the parallels between climbing mountains and writing stories and writing books, writing novels in particular, because so many of these mountains, when you start off climbing, you know that the peak is out there and it's,
yeah,
6 miles away or 9 miles away or however many miles away. But when you're hiking, you can't see where you're going. You can't see it until you're almost there. You can
yeah,
just see the next 50 yards. Sometimes you can see a landmark that's, half a mile away. Sometimes you'll get a glimpse of the mountain you're trying to climb from a mile and from 2 miles away. You're like, oh, it's over there. But then it disappears again.
yeah,
And there are false summits where you think you're there, but you're not. And then you have to hike down again and climb back up. And there's so much there are so many parallels for me between hiking and writing. And I think that's one of the things I really loved about that time when I was climbing the high peaks is that it reminded me of the faith needed to go on a hike where you can't see your destination. And that's
yeah.
what writing is every day.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a good note to end our conversation on. That's a wonderful metaphor to think about as we do that. Well, Kate, it's been lovely to have you as a guest and in conversations. I've loved our conversation. I hope other people do as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.